Good to see everybody. We're going to get started here. I'm going to share, and we will jump right in. So, full packed agenda today, but without a lot of variety. We're going to talk. I'm going to give you a little bit of feedback and talk a little bit about your project planning. I want to have a discussion about the types of interviews that you can do and how those are interconnected and connected to your challenge question. And I also want to kind of introduce us to the story of us and kind of continue our conversation on our public narrative as defined by Marshall Ganz. And then this afternoon and tomorrow in lab, we'll have an opportunity to share on the impact gap analysis and begin your work collectively on the story of us with some time for workshopping. So first, I have to say, thank you for the work that you're putting in, not just on the project plan, but on your projects. I would say that compared to groups in the past, you're a little bit ahead. I appreciate that you guys are having meetings. You have a repository, you're collecting things, you're thinking about the interviews, you've started the interviews. I think that all of that stuff is great. So I really appreciate the effort, and I think all 5 of the groups in this class are kind of on their way to kind of starting to get at, to come up with some ideas to solve the challenges that you've been working on. That said, these next 10 days, I think I mentioned this last week and in some of the meetings, these next 10 days are the key days for you to be able to move on with your projects. Because after this week, we start using the information that you're gathering and the insights that you're gathering to start to explore some potential ideas. And so I asked this question at the beginning of every class, is like, are you going to have more creativity with more choices or less? And the answer to that, of course, is more. So the more choices and the more insights you have, the better position you're going to be in next week as we start to get through the impact gap analysis and start to get into things like the idea sketch, right? You have to have a lot of choices to come up with the themes that are going to go into that. So interviews, interviews, interviews. I've been very happy with the secondary research. I think some of your ideas have been spot on, and I've kind of learned a little bit in looking at a number of them and identifying what you need to know. If there were 2 pieces of advice or feedback that I would have to give, the first one is interviewing more students, and that's going to be kind of the focus of a chunk of lecture today. Like I'm going to take some time on that because I've kind of identified that as an issue. The second one is I want to just give you a little bit of help and some guidance on the questions and the way that you're asking your questions. And I have to say right up front, I'm really excited to be having this conversation because I can't talk to you about the types of questions that you're asking if you're not asking questions. And so there's a couple of things that I would like to add here to provide you maybe with a little bit more of a user-centered framework and an open-ended framework on some of the questions that you have. The way, and a number of you know this, but I think it bears some repeating for everybody. The way that you ask a question is going to dictate in large extent to the answer that you're going to get. Right? So if you ask an open-ended question, you're going to get a more open-ended answer. If you ask a more specific question, you're going to get a more specific answer. But what you're giving up is the opportunity to get some differences of view or insight or opinion, right? And the reason that I like the open-ended questions up front is because, number one, they are usually still very problem-focused and user-focused. You're asking somebody's opinion in general as opposed to somebody's opinion about something that's been narrowed down probably by you or your stakeholders or previous interviewees, which, as you get down the road and you want to know specific things about your challenge, that's totally fine. But if you lead with specific questions, not only would you get more specific answers, but you really decrease the possibility that somebody is going to come up with an insight that's really going to surprise you or be really outside of the box, right? So, for example, I'm just taking questions that came from a project that we did last year, right? So if you ask the question, have you had any problems getting information from the financial aid office about completing the FAFSA form? There's an assumption there, which is the financial aid office is a problem, right? That's one assumption. And number two is that people should be having problems with the financial aid office, right? So that is a question, if you're leading with that question, that has a type of an answer already built in. And in fact, the answer that you're going to get is probably going to be a negative one because it's problem focused, right? But it's also going to be focused on the financial aid office. And in a lot of cases, not only are you trying to define the problem with the experience, in just about every one of the cases, I think in this in this year's questions, you are also looking for possible solutions and best practices. So if you have a problem-centered question, the opportunity that you're going to get a really insightful solution is very unlikely, right? As opposed to where have you gone to get information about completing the FAFSA form? Because if 70% of the people go to the financial aid office and 28% of the people go to the .gov website for financial aid and FAFSA, but one person has a resource that they use that nobody else is using that you might want to replicate. Maybe there's a nonprofit that provides FAFSA assistance to first-generation students that you could tap into that hardly anybody knows about. And that organization, maybe they're trying to go to scale. You would lose that opportunity for a possible solution or insight by the way that you ask the question. Okay, so keep in mind that at this point, open is okay. And think about it, if somebody does tell you that they have asked the financial aid office, there's a really good bet that the next thing that they're going to tell you without you asking is, and they didn't tell me a thing, or I couldn't get a meeting with them, or, hey, I really like the way that they have their resources online, right? So you can get more information about the financial aid office. And if they bring up the financial aid office and they stop, you can probe. Well, how was your experience with them? Who was helpful? What kind of resources did they have that you really liked? Okay. That's the beauty of having an in-person interview, right? Is you can ask those questions and then you can drill down and start to record those insights. The other strategy that I really like, and a number of you did, right? You can have a series of questions, right? So you can get to the point where you're asking for any information about the financial aid office, or you can ask a question that's based on your challenge opportunity, right? So if we're looking for the experience of students at Loyola filling out and completing the FAFSA form, go ahead and lead with that question, right? And some of the guidelines in the tutorials we've had, and certainly they talk about this in the IDEO guide. So, you want to have kind of easier questions up front. Well, what easier question do you have after you've introduced yourself and what your charge is than to ask an open-ended question about somebody's experience along the lines of that question? So what has your experience completing the FAFSA form been like? Because if you get the 1 out of 10 person that said, you know what, it was so much easier this year. Like I remember last year it was awful. It was so much easier this year because, and there's your insight and you're off to the races. Okay. So as you're structuring your questions, again, I'm able to have this conversation because you're asking a lot of questions. So thank you very much for that. And again, I really want to continue to emphasize, your challenge question. Your challenge question is your North Star in this process. The only difference between your challenge question and the real North Star is that you can change your challenge question. So on a daily basis, it will be your North Star that you will continue to refer to, right? And so our really what we're trying to figure out is how we could use that challenge question to guide our thinking about the choices we make and the outcomes that we pursue, right? And in this early stage, when we're going for inspiration, we are collecting insights, right? And the insights that we have are going to impact our, not only are they going to address our challenge question, but as we start to get them in themes develop, they may impact the actual makeup of our challenge question, right? So if a question that talked about creating generational wealth for first-generation college students goes out into the field and the theme about FAFSA comes back, that challenge question can change. So I would encourage you periodically, anytime you have to turn something in, but when you're turning something in, you're usually at a key milepost of this process, that you reflect on your challenge question. Is this still the direction that we want to go? If you come up with those themes, that would be a good time for you to touch base with your key contact and say, hey, this is what we're starting to hear. Does this make sense if we move in this direction, right? And when you have that challenge question, then it is going to impact your plan, right? And this is what you've put together. And then your plan is going to dictate the secondary research and the interviews that you use. So I want to take an opportunity here, since you've been through this and you have just submitted a project plan, that this process is not a linear process. You don't do the project plan and then do the interviews and you're done. You will consistently and constantly be setting up plans, one, so that you can keep track, two, so that there can be some accountability, and three, so that you're consistently planning around the insights and the information that you have to move forward, right? Because that plan is going to dictate the insights that you get, right? The research that you do and the questions that you ask are going to dictate the insights that you get, and the insights that you get are going to impact your challenge opportunity statement, right? So this is an ongoing process. The other thing that I want to point out here, because we're also going to talk a lot about stories today, is look at how this is set up, right? You have a challenge. To address that challenge, you make choices, right? You've made choices on how you're going to execute your plan, who you're going to talk to, what questions you're going to ask them. And based on the choices that you make, there is an outcome, which is a list of insights that now goes and impacts the experience that you're having and the challenge that you have, right? Challenge, choice, outcome. So when you're explaining this process, it's teed up really nicely for your story, okay? So you've all been asking and interviewing questions. As groups, you did a pretty good job kind of delineating the types of people that you're interviewing, whether they be stakeholders or users or experts, and that's great. So thank you for that. And that is important. But ultimately, every time you're going to ask a question, you ask yourself a couple of things. What is it that you need to know? Right? In some of the meetings that I had, and in the work that I've seen from you all so far, there are things that come up that are really, really interesting. But you have to ask yourself the question, is this really interesting insight within the scope of our question, right? You don't have to use every single insight, right? So that's really important, right? And then if it is, you know, asking yourself, who or where do we need to go to get the answer, right? And you have set these things up, right? You're going to recruit people. There's the expert interview. There's the group interview if you want to interview a couple people at one time. Extremes, people that might use your solution or kind of infrequent users, and mainstreams, students at Loyola that are online, students at Loyola in STEM, right? students at Loyola that engage the library, that are part of student organizations that want to engage in archive, right? These are all mainstreams. This is one of the things that I see. And this isn't a student thing. This is a human-centered design thing. The tendency for people when there are charts and planning is to do a lot of planning and to not do the work, right? So if we go back to our initial behaviors that we talked about, there's this whole idea of realness or doing, right? So yes, I would like you to be mindful about the questions you ask and the people that you talk to, but just as important is the fact that you're out there and asking people questions, right? So yes, you can go through and do that chart, but don't spend a lot of time saying, I'm going to wait 3 days until we meet to ask it. You got to start asking people these questions. You need to get out and you do it. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I have to think about this a little bit because it's one of those things that kind of happens reflexively, but also is very difficult to happen now because we're online. The meetings that you have had that you have invited me to during the week are now happening on Zoom. If we were in class, those meetings would be happening in the study or outside of Starbucks or outside of Boulder, right? Or in the Lang Lounge in our makerspace or the suite. And what we would probably do is talk about the questions and the things that you were going to ask and what you were interested in. And the next thing that we would do is stand up and I would send you outside to go ask the questions. I would stand you at the top of the stairs on the second floor of Sellinger as classes were changing. Or if we were at Lang Lounge, I would put you on the bridge where people could not get past you to ask. You don't have to ask your whole battery of questions, but maybe those general questions about your challenge question. What has your experience been, or what would you like your experience to be? And starting to talk to users as quickly as possible. When we do, and I went through the training, you can picture if you've ever been to DC in the Verizon Center, the AARP offices are literally the block across the street from the Verizon Center, or Capital One Arena, they call it now. And then kitty corner from the Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian Portrait Gallery. And so at that point where we were talking about our idea, they threw us all out of the office. So it's all these folks that are going out across that part of DC and into the Portrait to go and to talk to people and to get, remember, you're trying to be inspired. What do people think of these things, right? And you're immediately getting insights. So on a couple of groups, as I'm giving you feedback about more students, yes, have your questions, but literally tonight during lab, you can talk to people. Right? Talk to students, users. Right? The interviews are hard. You feel like you're taking up people's time. You don't think that people will be interested in your story or what you have to say. But again, and I've mentioned this, one of the most flattering questions that you can ask somebody is, what is your opinion? And if you're doing that for a reason that you can very easily define, that we'll get into as we talk about our stories, I'm working on with somebody who has a position to make a change. We want to know what you think. Most people will answer your question. Because the reason that this is a problem or a challenge that you're addressing is because it does impact a lot of students and people. And that brings us to our segue, our public story of us as we continue our public narrative. Now, we've had a chance now to introduce ourselves to each other. So that is you reflecting on your values and who you are and what you are for, why you have been called, what you've been called to do. And that certainly is the story of us, and we have done that. And then we basically, each of you individually reflected and filled out a very formal chat to me, putting together your priorities so that you, and based on your values and your interests, you chose a challenge. And now that you've been working on that for a couple of weeks, your group has become an us, okay? And so now you're in a position to start to develop that story of us. Okay, so I want to take an opportunity here to get back into GANs and get back into this whole thing about public stories. And I will keep telling you, we'll dive into this a little deeper as to why they work, right? Why we're using stories to be able to convey these messages. And so as we talk about the stories of us, we're talking about introducing you. Again, why have you chosen the path you have chosen, right? When you do that in an authentic way, you have an opportunity to develop an empathetic connection, right? For somebody to feel and see what you feel and see. And think about that. When your story has to do with your own empathy and challenge and work with other people, how much more compelling that is, right? So compelling that if you do it appropriately, that you have an opportunity to develop an emotional and an intellectual insight for your listener or your reader into your values, right? That demonstrates why you've chosen to act on your values in that way. That develops a connection, right? And that's a connection that you need. The other piece here, right? You have to be very upfront to clarify what can be expected from you. Okay? And again, this is all about the authenticity, vulnerability, right? You're going to be asking people for something. You're going to be teaching them something. You're going to be asking them to follow you. It's very important that they know what they can expect from you so that this trust develops, right? Because we can learn something from you, right? Keep in mind that in general, on a whole, people are living, growing, curious beings. We are programmed to seek out and to learn, especially about challenges and issues that we share, right? We're looking to access moral resources to face difficult choices. And if you don't believe me, go to Amazon or go to a bookstore and see how many self-help books there are, or how many books about leadership where there is a personal story, or about personal finance, where there is a story there that people overcame. And the better the story, the better the book sells, right? Nobody's selling more books by engaging in more technical accounting principles, right? It's about the story, right? And the other piece too, don't be afraid to tell your story because you think that your story isn't compelling or that nobody will care or that you're putting people out. Just know that as you tell a story and you share, you are utilizing thousands of years of evolution in psychology to your advantage, right? That's why movies work. That's why people spend money to go see them. Think how many books have been read, right? People want to know a story. Right? These stories are best when they detail your experience, because when it's detailed, it can be shared. You've seen this before, right? You communicate your values, not as abstract principles, right? Not as one or some, but as I and we, right? It's about you. Right? And your lived and shared experiences, right? They're specific, they're visual, they infect. And when you do that, when you start connecting with somebody, and this happens to you too, you start to think about a particular point in time where you have been, right? When they talk about a place, setting, mood, color, you know, a beautiful fall day in upstate New York where the leaves are in peak bloom and there's a nice breeze blowing across the willow tree next door, right? That's what I'm looking at outside my window right now. The more specific that you can get, right, the more power you have to engage. Those of you that watch Dr. Carlucci's talk at the new student orientation ceremony, right? She invoked all of the senses in that passage in the beginning when she described what it was like for her to move from Florida to Baltimore, what she wouldn't taste, and how the smells would be different, right? Maybe you're thinking about your own time coming to Baltimore if you're not from here, or a time when you did have to move, right? The more emotion, the more power that you have to engage others and to move others, right? So there's emotion again, right? If you don't describe it, it doesn't happen by accident. That can be verbally described or visually, right? If you are crying or showing that empathy on your face when you describe it, or that excitement. Teach us how, these stories can teach us how we ought to act, inspire us with the courage to act, right? This is what your story can teach us, right? Through the use of imagination, right? If you did it, I can do it. And if you're doing it and I'm doing it, we're doing it, and I may have the courage to do it as well, right? And again, we have had this conversation and we have talked about it, right? You've seen this slide before, the intimacy of shared experiences. And the more details that you use, the more emotions that you can evoke or sensations that you can evoke, right? The more opportunities that you have where some of these are going to connect with people. More intimacy equals more chances to connect. Now, I want to kind of flip the meaning of power here. And I want to think back to a couple of weeks ago when we talked about power, which is the intersection of the resources you have and what you want, right? That's power, right? So I want to think about power as a resource or an asset here, right? And with any asset that you have, especially one in the public domain, you have a responsibility for that asset, right? You have a responsibility in this case to offer a public account of who you are, what you want to do, and where you hope to lead, right? Because you also have a responsibility towards stewardship, right? Like any resource. If you don't steward your resource, it will be co-opted or go away or lose its value. So if you don't tell your public story, others will, and they may not tell it in the way you like, right? So if you go to a group of students to talk about equity and inclusion, and you're not very clear about what your intention is, you may turn into one of the 20 people that have talked to them about equity and inclusion over the last several years, or in particular the last several weeks. And they will label you or come up with an image of you about your story that isn't true. So it's important that you define it. And even when you do define it, that could happen. We use a consistent and detailed plot to share emotional experiences that teach and inspire courage, right? So our purpose with our power, or what we want, is to move others to act in a way we'd like them to. Think about that. We want to move others to act, right? We could upset somebody and they could act in a way completely different than we would like them to. We would like them to join us, share their values, their connection, their motives, and join with us. That is what you're starting to develop now in your stories, right? To fill our needs to get what we want. This is not a narcissistic plan, right? The narcissistic plan, or a fake plan, right, in doing this would be quite possible, except let's go back to the top piece here. You're offering a very public account of who you are, what you're doing, and what you hope to lead. You're very upfront. If somebody doesn't want to get on board with that, that's fine. It's not like you're trying to trick them. But you do want to find people that feel the same way. and get them on board to what you want to do. And in just about every case of what you're doing, you are working toward a values-based collective solution for others, which is a somewhat noble thing. It just might not resonate with everybody, right? And you're not trying to trick people, right? Your stories are a resource or power. The people that tell them well are the people that can move other people. And that's why we do this. It's important to me. I think it's going to be important. And it's important to me because of the importance that it has when you're engaging in a social mission. And the feedback that we get on this, the value to tell stories is immense, right? And we've talked about our plot, right? And as Gans describes, it's a protagonist, somebody that we're in favor of moving towards a desired goal, right? What they want, and they run into an unexpected event, right? There's a cliff. We lost the rent money. We've got 24 hours before the disease overtakes everybody. There's a crisis. That's compelling, right? And with that, you engage your listeners' curiosity, because then they want to know, it's like, well, what choices did you make? Which is really academic way of saying, oh my God, what did you do? People want to know that. And then when you tell them what you did, it's like, well, how'd it turn out? You wouldn't just tell somebody what you did and walk away. That's the outcome. It's the challenge, the choice, and the outcome, which is why your stories are structured the way that they are. Okay? So before you can create your story of us, I'm very mindful of the fact that although you've been working together for a couple of weeks, you need to create your us, right? You're getting together with meetings. I jump on some of the calls, and some of you are familiar with each other. And very often, if you're the first group, people are connecting and saying hello and getting close to each other. But you have to be mindful of this, right? I've talked from the beginning of the class, one of the biggest values that you can learn in putting this class together is not just creating a culture and an environment that you're excited to work in, that's going to drive creativity and transformational innovative solutions that values diversity and accountability and all the things that we've talked about, right? But you have to get that group together and maintain them, right? And that's important, right? So what happens now is your challenge, your values that were your individual challenge and values now become your plural values. And if you don't have a conversation about that or explore it, you're not really going to know how that fits together so that you can convey it to somebody else, right? And just like I asked you to connect your individual values to where you got them so that you were telling a story as to where they came from, you're going to have to connect your values to your challenge. If you were, and what's compelling is when you tell the story of what drew you to the challenge, because that might draw me to the challenge. And I want to, right off the bat, what's the emotion here? What excites you about the challenge or the process? And so what I've put together for you is a worksheet that we're going to work on over the next couple of weeks so that you can develop not only your story of us, but they can help you develop your us. I'm very hesitant and understand that it could be viewed as somewhat anti-design to give you a template like that. So there is some latitude here to put these things together, but again, we're not all together, right? And so I'm trying to provide a little bit more of a foundation than I would in putting this template together, right? And so I've added this. And so the first thing that we need to do is you need to identify your you. And you may have conveyed this to your teammates, but maybe you haven't. And it's always great in relationships to share. So one of the things that we're going to talk about in lab today is going through and identifying who you are. So your challenge question, your values, how your values personally are reflected in this challenge. What drew you to the challenge question? And what are you excited about so far? Once you have that, we'll have an opportunity to get together and introduce your group and your selected intention as a whole, right? That you becomes plural, right? And what are your collective values? Keep in mind that when you have collective values, we does not need to be a consensus, right? So if service is a value, that doesn't mean that all 4 people in your group had service as one of their top 4 Barrett values on the assessment, right? You have collective values. Everybody brings their own expertise. Why can't everybody bring their own values? So there will be some that overlap, and my sense is that you will find those. Right? But what are the values that you have collectively? And in particular, what are the values that you have collectively that are going to address the challenge that you've chosen to take on? And why are you collectively drawn to that challenge? Right? What you're going to do here is you're going to create a reason for others to be called with you, right? And engage them. This work doesn't happen by itself, right? I've been in groups, I've been in groups myself, and I have taught groups that have had these wonderful connections and bonds, and the conversations go on past class and outside of class, and then after the course is over, because this has been worked on and shared. But there's also folks that they never see each other, especially at bigger schools, right? So for those of you that were looking for an opportunity to connect, which was probably 20 out of 24 of you when we were in the beginning, this is an opportunity to do that. So we're going to be mindful about it. Okay, and you'll have an opportunity to go through and to fill out the sheet and to start to fill some of these things in. Right, and when we get into lab, I'm going to show you some brainstorming techniques that we can use to help put these things together. Right, so you all have your values, and then what are your shared values? Why are you collectively drawn to this challenge? Who are you? Right, that was a forum post that we did for you all, where you had to introduce yourselves to us, and then that became the introductory piece of your story of self. You know, you collectively will be the introduction when you start to go out, when you're recruiting people, when you introduce yourself for an interview or with a stakeholder, or when you're presenting your findings. Who are you and what are your intentions? Okay. And then the next part is actually creating this story. And a little bit like we did before, if you answer all of these questions about your collective you, let's start putting them together in a story format, right? How your challenge or your response and involvement represents your values, right? What moment or aspect of this challenge or your experience working together has excited you so far, the most so far? It could be an interaction in a meeting. It could be an interview. It could be a sharing of insights. It could be any of those things where you got excited. You want to share that detail. You want to share that story, that instance in detail, just like you did when your parents taught you the value of honesty or service. What are the choices that your users have to make every day that defines this challenge? To stay in engineering or not, to have an informed decision on what type of diversity course they're going to take, or have there been key decisions that your key contact has had to make, or that you have had to make when you've been framing the question? Are we looking for the faculty view or the student's view? Are we looking for what's wrong, or what would be best practices moving forward, right? You have made some decisions here and some choices that are helping moving you forward, that are getting you to the point where you are right now. And then finally, what do you hope to achieve or accomplish? This is from the eyes of your users. They have a pain point. There's no equity and inclusion. We want there to be a more equitable and inclusive Selinger School of Business. We want there to be more women and people of color graduating from STEM, right? As opposed to, we want there to be better advisement. That's a solution. We want there to be a course in. That's a solution. Your outcome is that the pain point has gone away. A situation where that pain or that challenge has gone away. At this point, it's not necessarily how it happens. Okay, so again, staying in the problem. There's some new material there. There is some stuff we've been over in the past. As you're thinking about this and considering this through the lens of your project, does anybody have any questions on the feedback, on the interview, on the questions, or on the stories? Those of you that submitted the project plan on behalf of your team, the Monday group, yours are done, and I've given them back to you. We will use that feedback today in lab. So if you want to pull it up, you can, so you have that. I haven't figured out if there's a way in Moodle that I can provide that to everybody. I can provide the grades to everybody. I just haven't figured out how I can do the feedback, but you do have it. The Tuesday folks, you will have it soon. I just have to enter it into your groups into Moodle. So in lab, we're going to be translating the feedback that you get from your plan to how you're going to move forward. We're going to be spending some time on the impact gap analysis. There'll be some sharing on that, a little bit differently than we've done in the past. And then there'll be an opportunity to start workshopping your story of us. Okay. Any questions? I will turn you loose 5 minutes early. I look forward to seeing a bunch of you at 4:20.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.